for the hardest-hitting show in talk radio. The true progressive voice since 2012. This is Southpaws.
And welcome to Southpaws on the Pacifica Radio Network. We are the leaders of the revolution. I'm Darren Gibson, your host today. We're going to take a look at the conflict between Israel and Hamas, plus we'll go over some history between Israel and Palestine over the years. Steve Scalise has been nominated to be the next Speaker of the House. We'll see if he can get there. Representative George Santos might be facing expelling from the House because of new charges against him. And we're going to spend a lot of time on Ottawa County and Ottawa Impact because there's a lot of updates involving the health department and Ottawa County, Michigan. So we will talk about all of that. Before we get started with today's topics, a couple of reminders. You can follow us on social media by going to facebook.com/Southpaws Radio Show. You can follow us on X at Southpaws Radio. You can follow us on Tumblr at southpawsradioshow.tumblr.com. You can follow us on YouTube and Mastodon by doing a search for Southpaws Radio. And you can become a patron of the show by going to patreon.com/Southpaws Radio. You can listen to the show anytime at Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Google Podcasts, Podcast Addict, Podvine, and Pandora by doing a search for Southpaws. Once you found our logo, you found us. We send links to our weekly episodes to our Facebook, X, YouTube, Mastodon, and Tumblr accounts. You can listen to us on Global Community Radio Channel 1 every Saturday night at 11 Eastern. And you can listen to us on great Pacifica stations, including KCEI in Taos, New Mexico, KZGM in Kabul, Missouri, and WMTB St. Petersburg, Florida. So be sure to listen to us on your local Pacifica affiliate. All right, let's go to the latest involving Israel and Hamas. This is Isabel Debris writing for the Associated Press out of Jerusalem. This is dated October 12th, which is the day that we are recording this show. The Israeli military is preparing for a possible ground operation in Gaza, but the political leadership has not yet decided on one. That is according to Lieutenant Colonel Richard Heck, who told this to reporters on Thursday as the latest Israel-Palestinian war rolled into a sixth day of fighting since Hamas launched its attack Saturday. Hamas said it's seeking to end Palestinian suffering, which had become intolerable under unending Israeli military occupation and increasing settlements in the West Bank and a 16-year-long blockade in Gaza. People in Gaza spent the Wednesday night in darkness, surrounded by the ruins of pulverized neighborhoods, as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed to crush and destroy Hamas with the support of a new war cabinet that includes a longtime opposition critic. The latest conflict, which has claimed at least 2,600 lives on both sides, is expected to escalate. Here are some key takeaways from the war. As the Israeli military retaliates for the Hamas attack, Palestinians say civilians are paying the price in strikes on Gaza, a small coastal strip of land packed with 2.3 million residents. Near constant airstrikes that level entire neighborhoods have forced some 340,000 people to flee their homes, according to the United Nations, most crowding into UN schools. Others sought the shrinking number of safe neighborhoods. Gaza is only 25 miles long, wedged among Israel, Egypt, and the Mediterranean Sea. The Hamas-run Interior Ministry said Israeli strikes demolished two multi-story houses without warning, killing and wounding a large number of people, mainly civilians. While Israel has insisted that it is giving advance notice of its strikes, it is employing a new tactic of leveling whole swaths of neighborhoods rather than just individual buildings. The United Nations said that the Israel siege has also resulted in dire water shortages for over 650,000 people. Israel has cut off supplies of food, fuel, electricity, and medicine into Gaza, plunging many Palestinians into pitch blackness after the only power station ran out of fuel and shut down. Hospital supplies of medicine and fuel for emergency generators are also expected to run out within days. At least 1,417 people have been killed in Gaza, according to authorities there. Israel says hundreds of the dead inside Gaza are Hamas members. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Heck told reporters Thursday that Israeli military forces are preparing for a possible ground operation in Gaza, but that political leadership has not yet decided on one, but forces are, quote, preparing for a ground maneuver if decided, end of quote. Israel's government is under intense pressure from the public to topple Hamas, which has ruled Gaza since 2007. Israel has called up some 360,000 army reservists and has threatened an unprecedented response to Hamas's bloody, wide-ranging incursion over the weekend. The Israeli military said more than 1,300 people, including 222 soldiers, have been killed in Israel, a staggering toll unseen since the 1973 war with Egypt and Syria that lasted weeks. The Israeli military said it is currently targeting Hamas's senior military and political leaders, whom it blames for the weekend attack. 4 previous rounds of Israel-Hamas fighting between 2008 and 2021 all ended inconclusively, with Hamas battered but still in control. Removing it from power would likely require reoccupying Gaza, at least temporarily. Even then, Hamas has a long history of operating as an underground insurgency in areas controlled by Israel. A ground offensive would also likely result in a surge of casualties on both sides. The risk of the war spreading beyond Gaza was evident Wednesday when the Iranian-backed Lebanese militant group Hezbollah fired anti-tank missiles at an Israeli military position and claimed to have killed and wounded troops. The Israeli military confirmed the attack but did not comment on possible casualties. The Israeli army shelled the area in southern Lebanon where the attack was launched. On Thursday, Syrian state media reported that Israeli airstrikes hit the international airports of the Syrian capital Damascus and the northern city of Aleppo, damaging their runways and putting them out of service. President Joe Biden Wednesday called the attack by Hamas the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust, as the number of U.S. citizens killed in the fighting increased to at least 25 on Thursday. Signs of U.S. support for Israel were seen across the administration, with Secretary of State Antony Blinken meeting with Netanyahu and later Israeli President Isaac Herzog in Tel Aviv on Thursday. British Foreign Secretary James Cleverly arrived in Israel on Wednesday to express unwavering solidarity with the country following the attacks by Hamas, while Britain's King Charles III condemned the, quote, barbaric acts of terrorism in Israel, end of quote. The German government held a minute of silence Wednesday in Parliament for the Israeli victims of the Hamas attacks. Malaysian Foreign Minister Zamri Abdul Qadir slammed Israel's outrageous acts of cruelty in cutting off food, water, and fuel to the Gaza Strip and said Malaysia will provide an emergency fund to help Palestinians. Turkey is holding negotiations for the release of civilian hostages held by Hamas, according to a Turkish official on Wednesday. Egypt has engaged with intensive talks with Israel and the United States to allow the delivery of aid and fuel through its Rafah crossing point. However, it pushed back against proposals to establish escape corridors out of Gaza, saying an exodus of Palestinians from the enclave would have grave consequences on the Palestinian cause. Once again, the U.S. now says 25 Americans are dead. They said at least 17 more Americans remain unaccounted for. That's according to the State Department. The Chinese government said Thursday that 3 of its citizens were confirmed dead, 2 others missing. The Chinese embassy in Israel had reported earlier this week that a young woman of Israeli and Chinese heritage was among the scores of hostages taken by Hamas fighters. 2 Brazilian citizens were killed as the result of the Hamas attack on Israel, according to that country's foreign ministry, which also said that 3 people with dual Brazilian-Israeli citizenship were missing after they disappeared at the music festival outside of Kibbutz Re'im. The Estonian government confirmed the death on Thursday of an Estonian-Israeli man after Hamas's attack on Israel. Turkish officials also announced that at least one Turkish citizen was also killed in the attacks. Hamas, which seeks Israel's destruction, said it is defending Palestinians' rights to freedom and self-determination. But the devastation following Hamas's surprise attack on Saturday has sharpened questions about its strategy and objectives. Hamas officials have said they plan for all possibilities, including a punishing Israeli escalation. Desperation has grown among Palestinians, many of whom see nothing to lose under unending Israeli control and increasing settlements in the West Bank, the blockade in Gaza, and what they see as the world's apathy. In addition to citing long-simmering tensions, Hamas officials cited a long-running dispute over the sensitive Al-Aqsa Mosque that is sacred to both Muslims and Jews. Competing claims over the site, known to Jews as the Temple Mount, have spilled into violence before, including a bloody 11-day war between Israel and Hamas just 2 years ago. Tensions between Israel and the Palestinians escalated with recent violent Palestinian protests. In negotiations with Qatar, Egypt, and the United Nations, Hamas has pushed for Israeli concessions that could loosen the blockade on the Gaza Strip and help halt a worsening financial crisis. So I guess in order to understand this a little bit better, we have to go back in history. So let's get to this piece. This is from France24.com. That's one of the big news agencies in France. They go through a history of what's been happening involving the formation of Israel and the Palestinians. So let's go to this. 1947. Thousands of European Jewish immigrants, many of them Holocaust survivors, board a ship which came to be called Exodus 1947, bound for then British-controlled Palestine. Heading for the Promised Land, they are intercepted by British naval ships and sent back to Europe. Widely covered by the media, the incident sparks international outrage and plays a critical role in convincing the UK that a United Nations brokered solution is necessary to solve the Palestinian crisis. A UN Special Committee proposes a partition plan giving 56.47% of Palestine for a Jewish state and 44.53% for an Arab state. Palestinian representatives reject the plan, but their Jewish counterparts accept it. On November 29th, the UN General Assembly approved the plan with 33 countries voting for partition, 13 voting against it, and 10 abstentions. Among the countries voting for the plan included the United States and the then Soviet Union. 1948 and 49. On May 14th, David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, publicly reads the Proclamation of Independence. The declaration, which would go into effect the next day, comes a day ahead of the expiration of the British mandate on Palestine. The Jewish state takes control of 77% of the territory of Mandate Palestine, according to the United Nations. For Palestinians, this date marks the Nakba, the catastrophe that heralds their subsequent displacement and dispossession. As hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, hearing word of massacres in villages such as Deir Yassin, flee toward Egypt, Lebanon, and Jordanian territory, the armies of Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq attack Israel, launching the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The Arab armies are repelled, the ceasefires declared, and new borders more favorable to Israel are drawn. Jordan takes control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, while Egypt controls the Gaza Strip. 1956, the Second Arab-Israeli War, or the Suez Crisis, takes place after Egypt nationalizes the Suez Canal. In response, Israel, the United Kingdom, and France form an alliance, and Israel occupies the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula. The Israeli army eventually withdraws its troops under pressure from the U.S. and the Soviet Union. 1959, Yasser Arafat sets up the Palestinian organization Fatah in Gaza and Kuwait. It later becomes the main component of the Palestine Liberation Organization. The PLO was created in 1964. 1967, the Third Arab-Israeli War, the Six-Day War between Israel and its Arab neighbors, results in a dramatic redrawing of the Middle East map. Israel seizes the West Bank and East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. 1973, on October 6, during the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, Egyptian and Syrian armies launch offensives against Israel, marking the start of a new regional war. The Yom Kippur War, which ends 19 days later with Israel repelling the Arab armies, results in heavy casualties on all sides, at least several thousand deaths. 1979, an Israeli-Egyptian peace agreement is sealed in Washington following the Camp David Accord signed in 1978 by Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. According to the terms of this agreement, Egypt regains the Sinai Peninsula, which it had lost after the Six-Day War. Sadat becomes the first Arab leader to recognize the State of Israel. 1982, under Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, Israeli troops storm into neighboring Lebanon in a controversial military mission called Operation Peace of Galilee. The aim of the operation is to wipe out Palestinian guerrilla bases in southern Lebanon, but Israeli troops push all the way to the Lebanese capital of Beirut. The subsequent routing of the PLO under Arafat leaves the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon essentially defenseless. From September 16th through the 18th, Lebanese Christian Phalangist militiamen with ties to Israel enter the camps of Sabra and Shatila in Beirut, unleashing a brutal massacre that shocks the international community. The massacre is the subject of an Israeli inquiry, popularly called the Kahane Commission, would subsequently cost Sharon his job as defense minister. 1987, uprisings in Palestinian refugee camps in Gaza spread to the West Bank, marking the start of the first Palestinian Intifada, which stands for uprising in Arabic. Nicknamed the War of Stones, the first Intifada lasts until 1993, costing more than 1,000 Palestinian lives. The image of the stone-throwing Palestinian demonstrators pitched against Israel's military might comes to symbolize the Palestinian struggle. It was also during this uprising that Hamas, influenced by the ideology of Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood, was born. From the outset, the Islamist movement favors armed struggle and rejects outright any legitimacy of an Israeli state. 1993, after months of frantic secret negotiations, Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin signed the Oslo Accords. The accords see the creation of the Palestinian Authority, which gets administrative control of the West Bank and Gaza. On September 13th, on the White House lawn, Arafat and Rabin exchange a historic handshake in the presence of U.S. President Bill Clinton. The event is watched by over 400 million television viewers around the world. 1995, on November 4th, Rabin is assassinated by a Jewish right-wing extremist at a peace rally in Tel Aviv. The following year, Benjamin Netanyahu is elected prime minister for the first time. And by the way, Netanyahu is basically Israel's version of Donald Trump. 2000. On September 28th, Sharon provokes Palestinians by making a tour of Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Temple Mount site as leader of the right-wing Likud party, sparking the Second Intifada, also known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada. It lasted until 2005, with 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis killed over 5 years. 2001, Sharon is elected Prime Minister of Israel and breaks off contact with Arafat, who is subsequently confined to his compound in Ramallah. 2002, the Israeli government begins Operation Defensive Shield, the construction of a wall to separate Israel from the West Bank. The UN Security Council speaks for the first time of a coexistence between the two states of Israel and Palestine. The Israeli army lifts the siege on Ramallah. 2004, on March 22nd, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the paraplegic co-founder and spiritual leader of Hamas, is killed by an Israeli helicopter strike. 8 months later, on November 11th, PLO chairman Arafat dies at a Paris hospital following a prolonged illness. Arafat's death has been the subject of controversy. Some experts believe he died of natural causes, while others are open to the possibility that he was poisoned using polonium-210. 2005, Mahmoud Abbas is elected president of the Palestinian Authority. After a 38-year occupation, Israel pulls out of Gaza. 2006, on January 4th, Prime Minister Sharon suffers a stroke and falls into a coma that he stays in until his death in 2014. Ehud Olmert takes over as Prime Minister and head of Sharon's newly founded centrist party, Kadima. Hamas sweeps the legislative elections in the Palestinian territories, causing the U.S. and European Union to freeze direct aid to the Palestinian government. Lebanese Islamic fundamentalist group Hezbollah launches rocket attacks on Israel and takes 2 Israeli soldiers captive. Israel retaliates with force and many civilians, many Lebanese, are killed. The war, widely viewed as a failure in Israel, led to mounting calls for Olmert to resign. 2007, following months of internecine military fighting between Hamas and Fatah forces, Hamas seizes control of Gaza. 2008, on December 27th, the Israeli Defense Forces launch a surprise offensive on Gaza, killing more than 200 people in one day. Shortly after, the IDF follows up with a 2-week-long ground invasion of Gaza. A UN report concluded that both Israel and Hamas committed war crimes during the conflict. 2009, on January 18th, Israel and Hamas declare unilateral ceasefires, ending the 22-day battle, which killed more than 1,300 Palestinians as well as 13 Israelis. 2011, on March 27th, Israel deploys an anti-rocket missile defense system called the Iron Dome, which allows the country to intercept short-range rockets regularly fired from Gaza. 2012, Israeli forces kill top Hamas commander Ahmed al-Jabari in an airstrike on November 14th, and follow with more strikes over an 8-day campaign during which Hamas retaliates by firing rockets at Jerusalem for the first time. More than 130 Palestinians as well as 5 Israelis are killed. 2014, in June, 3 Israeli teenagers are abducted and murdered near the West Bank city of Hebron. Israeli authorities blame Hamas for the incident and on July 8th launched multiple airstrikes on the Gaza Strip, prompting an exchange of rocket fire with Hamas over a 7-week period. The Israeli missile strikes result in the deaths of more than 2,200 Palestinians in Gaza. 2018, on March 30th, tens of thousands of Palestinians rally near the Israeli border in the Gaza Strip to protest Israel's blockade of the enclave. Demonstrations continue for several months. At least 189 Palestinians were killed, more than 6,000 injured during these protests between the end of March and the end of December 2018. That is according to the Independent International Commission of Inquiry mandated by the United Nations Human Rights Council. 2021, Palestinian worshippers clash with Israeli police in May at Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque compound following weeks of mounting tension. Hamas unleashes a barrage of rockets into Israel after demanding Israeli forces withdraw from the compound. Israel responds with airstrikes on Gaza, setting off an 11-day conflict resulting in the deaths of more than 200 people. 2022, Israel pounds Gaza with airstrikes on August 5th, killing a senior militant of the Islamic Jihad group and triggering retaliatory rocket fire from the Palestinian enclave. At least 40 Palestinians are killed in the 3 days of fighting that follow. 2023, Israeli forces kill 9 Palestinian Islamic Jihad gunmen and civilians on January 26 in a raid on a flashpoint town in the occupied West Bank. Palestinian militants hit back by firing 2 rockets, triggering retaliation from Israel. No further casualties are reported. Then that leads us to October 7th of this year, Hamas mounting the unprecedented multi-pronged surprise attack on Israel, with fighters infiltrating the heavily fortified Gaza border in several locations by air, land, and sea. Israel responds with airstrikes on Gaza and military reinforcements to the border. So there's the history, pretty much the modern history of what is modern-day Israel and Palestine. I tell you what, we've had people that have said, oh, if you defend Palestine, then you're anti-Semitic. If you defend Israel, you are anti-Palestinian. You're basically racist toward Muslims. Whatever. Well, I tell you what, the official stance on this show is that both governments need to knock it off. because it's the civilians, the people that have no dog in this fight, that are the ones that are suffering. It is the civilians. It's not the military people. I tell you what would be nice, and I would love to see this, if countries want to fight, then the quote-unquote leaders need to go into a room and fist fight until one is left. If you knock the other one out, guess what? You won. You get whatever concessions, and you agree to it beforehand. If Gaza says, okay, we want our Hamas leader to fist fight Netanyahu, and all we want is the Israelis to get the hell out of Gaza. Okay, Israel, what do you want in return? Well, then if we'll do this if we win. Okay, ding, 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 fight. That would be great if that could happen, but it never happens like that. It's always people who are not involved are the ones that fight the wars, that are injured in the wars, that get killed during these wars. Where's the justice in that? That's what I'd like to know. All right, let's go ahead and get to our next story here. This is Lisa Mascaro and Kevin Frecking writing for the Associated Press. This is dated October 11th out of Washington. Republicans nominated Representative Steve Scalise on Wednesday to be the next House Speaker, but struggled to quickly unite their deeply divided majority and elect the conservative in a public floor vote after the historic ousting of Representative Kevin McCarthy from the job. In private balloting at the Capitol, House Republicans narrowly pushed aside Ohio Representative Jim Jordan, the Firebrand Judiciary Committee chairman, in favor of Scalise, the current majority leader. The Louisiana congressman, who is battling blood cancer, is seen as a hero to some after surviving a shooting on lawmakers at a congressional baseball game practice in 2017. Scalise said afterwards, quote, "We have a lot of work to do," end of quote. A floor vote of the whole House was expected, but tensions are still running high among Republicans who have brought the House to a standstill with bitter infighting after McCarthy's stunning removal last week. The House was gavelled into a brief session, then broke indefinitely with next steps uncertain. It's an extraordinary movement of political chaos at a time of uncertainty at home and crisis abroad, moving into a second week without a House Speaker. Just 10 months after Republicans swept to power, aspiring to operate as a team and run government more like a business, the GOP majority has drifted far from that goal. Scalise said, quote, "We need to make sure we're sending a message to people all throughout the world that the House is open to doing the people's business," end of quote. What's uncertain is whether lawmakers who supported Jordan, the hardliner backed by Donald Trump, will throw their support to Scalise in what is sure to be a close vote of the full House. Democrats are set to oppose the Republican nominee, easily nominating their leader, New York Representative Hakeem Jeffries. Jordan said little after the vote, only that the Republican majority is divided. But Jordan did offer to give Scalise a nominating speech on the floor in what would be a show of support during the vote. Representative Don Bacon, Republican of Nebraska, said, quote, "We do need to get a speaker in place so we can govern," end of quote. Bacon is seen as a centrist leader in the Republican Party. He added, quote, "What we should have heard today after the vote count was, 'I will heartily support Steve. Let's get behind him.' We did not hear that," end of quote. So there you go, folks. This is great stuff. And speaking of, there might be one less Republican in the House. This is Jake Offenhartz writing for the Associated Press. This is dated October 11th out of New York City. According to a new indictment, U.S. Representative George Santos stole the identities of donors to his campaign and then used their credit cards to ring up tens of thousands of dollars in unauthorized charges. Prosecutors said that he then wired some of the money to his own personal bank account while using the rest to inflate his campaign coffers. The 23-count indictment filed Tuesday replaces one filed in May against the New York Republican, charging him with embezzling money from his campaign and lying to Congress about his wealth, among other offenses. In the updated indictment, prosecutors accused Santos of charging more than $44,000 to his campaign over a period of months using cards belonging to contributors without their knowledge. Prosecutors said in one case he charged $12,000 to a contributor's credit card and transferred the vast majority of that money into his personal bank account. Santos is also accused of falsely reporting to the Federal Elections Commission that he had loaned his campaign $500,000 when he actually hadn't given anything and had less than $8,000 in the bank. The fake loan was an attempt to convince Republican Party officials that he was a serious candidate worth their financial support, according to the indictment. Oh, good Lord. They deflect and inflate to try and get power. They'll do anything to get in power, as we're seeing here. U.S. Attorney Breon Peace said in a statement, quote, "As alleged, Santos is charged with stealing people's identities and making charges on his own donors' credit cards without their authorization, lying to the FEC and by extension the public about the financial state of his campaign." End of quote. Santos came out of a 2-hour Republican conference at the U.S. Capitol and told reporters he had no comment on the superseding indictment. He said, quote, "I was in conference like everyone else without my phone, so I have nothing to say." End of quote. He has previously maintained his innocence, claiming he is the victim of a witch hunt. Well, he's taken the page right out of Donald Trump's playbook. The new charges deepen the legal peril for Santos, who likely faces a lengthy prison term if convicted. So far, he has resisted all calls to resign, insisting he intends to run for re-election next year. Santos's personal and professional biography as a wealthy businessman began to unravel soon after winning election to represent parts of Long Island and Queens last year, revealing a tangled web of deception. In addition to lying to voters about his distinguished Wall Street background, Jewish heritage, academic and athletic achievements, animal rescue work, real estate holdings, and more, Santos is accused of carrying out numerous schemes meant to enrich himself and mislead his donors. He was initially arrested in May on a 13-count federal indictment which charged him with using funds earmarked for campaign expenses on designer clothes and other personal expenses and improperly obtaining unemployment benefits meant for Americans who lost work because of the pandemic. Free on bail while awaiting trial, Santos has described his litany of lies as victimless embellishments while blaming some of his financial irregularities on his former campaign treasurer, Nancy Marks, who he claims went rogue. Yep, she went rogue, folks. Yeah. Last week, Marks, a longtime Long Island political bookkeeper, pleaded guilty to a fraud conspiracy charge, telling a judge she helped her former boss hoodwink prospective donors and Republican Party officials by submitting bogus campaign finance reports. Tuesday's indictment said Marks and Santos were involved in the same scheme to fake a $500,000 campaign loan in order to meet a benchmark that would unlock additional support from a Republican Party committee. Santos has now also been charged with recording fake donations from at least 10 people, all his or Marks's relatives, as part of the same effort to make the campaign look like it hit those fundraising goals. Santos was not initially charged in the criminal complaint against Marks, but was identified in court papers as a co-conspirator. The new indictment alleges a multi-part fraud by Santos, who allegedly duped both his donors and his family members. In one instance, Santos allegedly swiped the credit card information of one of his contributors who had already donated $5,800 to the campaign to give himself an additional $15,800 in payments, according to the indictment. Because the unauthorized charges exceed contribution limits under federal law, Santos listed the additional payments as coming from his own unwitting relatives, according to prosecutors. The credit card fraud scheme began in December 2021, according to prosecutors, shortly after Santos failed to qualify for a Republican Party program that would have provided financial and logistics support to his second congressional campaign. Prosecutors said in text messages to Marks at the time he described himself as, quote, lost and desperate, end of quote. Yeah, I'd say he's lost and desperate, all right. Oh, Lord. Financial questions have continued to swirl around Santos, who claimed to be rich, but spent much of his adulthood bouncing between low-paying jobs and unemployment, while fending off eviction cases and 2 separate criminal charges relating to his use of bad checks. So he's kiting. Oh, my gosh. A separate fundraiser for Santos, Sam Miele, was also previously indicted on federal charges that he impersonated a high-ranking congressional aide while soliciting contributions for the Republicans' campaign. Prosecutors said the 27-year-old Miele impersonated the former chief of staff to Republican Representative Kevin McCarthy, who at the time was the House Minority Leader, by setting up dummy email addresses that resembled the staffer's name. Miele's attorney, Kevin Marino, previously predicted his client would be exonerated at trial. Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, buddy. Keep dreaming. Oh, I love seeing Republicans get theirs. They deserve it. They're all crooked. Every single last one of them. All right, and we're going to go now to Ottawa County. We're going to try and go in order of date on this. We've talked about what Ottawa County, the Ottawa Impact-backed commissioners want to do to the health department, which is basically defund it. So we have this series of stories. First, this is Sarah Leach writing for the Holland Sentinel. This is dated October 8th. The Ottawa County Department of Public Health has laid off half a dozen staff members after the Board of Commissioners cut the department's budget by $4 million in September. OCDPH officials confirmed this week 6 people were notified on Friday, September 29th their employment was ending. All of the positions terminated were tied to grants the Ottawa Impact Control Board rejected for the 2024 fiscal year, which began October 1st. As we've mentioned before, Ottawa Impact is the far-right fundamentalist group formed in 2021 over school mask mandates during the COVID-19 pandemic. The group currently controls 6 seats on the 11-member board. After 2 months of meetings, debates, and changes, a pre-meeting protest, and more than 6 hours of public comment and debate September 26th, the board voted 7-3 to approve the budget, with 1 commissioner who abstained. Board Chair Joe Moss, the founder of Ottawa Impact, said he wanted to see the elimination of all COVID-19 related grants in budget, which accounted for $2.2 million in funding, according to health department officials. Moss and County Administrator John Whale Feces Gibbs have said repeatedly during the Finance Committee and board meetings the pandemic is over, citing the Biden administration's ending of the federal public health emergency declared in January 2020. They argued it was appropriate to return the health department budget to pre-COVID levels, although no other departments saw cuts. Some of them saw increases. COVID-19 has not been eradicated and remains prevalent, according to federal health officials. The Holland Sentinel spoke with 3 employees whose positions were terminated. 2 of them spoke on the condition of anonymity over fears of retaliation. One employee described the leadership change within the county as whiplash. They said, quote, "We had a board where they recognized your work and you had just so much pride. And then to go from that to a board where basically employees are treated as the enemy, and their main goal is, how do we punish the enemy? And if you're at the health department, you're at the top of the enemy list." End of quote. Despite positive leadership from embattled Health Officer Adeline Hambley and Deputy Health Officer Marcia Mansoray, the employees say that morale hit an all-time low in the waning weeks of September as budget negotiations dragged on. Many employees became especially paranoid with the department's social media accounts were taken over by Moss and Whale Feces in September. The employee said, quote, we're scared all the time and always paranoid. You don't have Zoom meetings or team meetings because the company could secretly be listening in. You don't want to email anything they can misinterpret in case they're going after your emails. You don't want a message or anything that could be misinterpreted. When they come to the brown bag lunch, you don't want to even attend because you don't want to say something that could be seen as angry, and you're so frustrated and you want to ask questions, but you don't want to do it because you don't want to get on their radar. End of quote. As cuts loomed, the first employee said the department became, quote, toxic and paranoid work culture because you're terrified all the time. I mean, it was so bad, Human Resources sent an email on Friday to all public health with a mental health crisis line to have more counseling sessions available. I'm like, what kind of work culture is it when HR is telling you here's a mental health crisis line? It's not good. End of quote. Those feelings were compounded when OI-backed commissioners made statements on their official pages. Quote, they're saying what a good job they did to get through the budget, and I'm like, hey, I lost my job, and you're patting yourself on the back? End of quote. The second employee said their concerns mounted when the board took aim at the health department months ago. Among allegations were Moss's erroneous claim the department sponsored Grand Valley State University's 2023 Sex Ed Week and that it was inappropriate for the department to have a presence at Pride events because children were vulnerable to quote-unquote grooming. The only ones that's grooming children are Republicans, period, end of story. The second employee said, quote, it was really interesting to see the wave of political transition with OI, but it was just very hard toward the end to feel validated in the work we were doing because the only voices we heard were theirs, and we knew there was public support, but it was really hard to stay true to that. Some days it was just constantly like layers of concrete being poured on top of us again and again and again, end of quote. Aaron Stauffer, a health educator, also lost his job in the recent layoffs. His greatest frustration is the claim by Whale Feces and Moss that Hambly didn't try to work with the board during the budget process, which Moss now says proves Hambly's neglect of her duties and therefore is a fireable offense. Moss filed the notice last week that he'll hold a hearing for removal of Hambly. And by the way, we'll talk more about that in the next couple of articles here. Let me continue. Stauffer said, quote, our leadership has just been almost absurdly positive and just incredibly good-natured toward this whole thing of hoping to work with the board. And they're kind of getting slandered as if they haven't been working with the board at all, which is completely the opposite. End of quote. Stauffer said he doesn't hold a personal grudge over the layoff because he knew his role was always temporary. But he said it's difficult to see grant dollars not getting used in ways that can help the public's health. Stauffer said, quote, I know about Moss and his gripes about the mask mandates. I was part of the people talking to schools, getting complaints about that particular school not wearing masks. So, of course, they're not going to like anything with COVID in the name. End of quote. He added, quote, but it's a little frustrating to know that we've got all these grants that are just going to get wasted. It has COVID in the name, but we were using it in a ton of other ways that were beyond just COVID. We were able to use it for initiatives for schools, providing generic disease prevention, stuff like sanitizer and tissues and thermometers, things that the schools were really grateful for, end of quote. The employee said that the most important thing is for locals to take elections seriously. The first employee said, quote, you've got to vote. You have to realize how important local elections are, end of quote. The second employee said, quote, I still remember the morning after they were all elected, and it was just like, oh my gosh, this couldn't have happened. This could not have happened. And I guess it brings back the importance of people knowing about local elections and what kind of consequences those may have for the future. End of quote. The second employee added that OI commissioners should be cautious as they proceed with future decisions. Quote, it's something that my dad has reiterated to me again and again and again with everything going on. Bitterness destroys the container it's in. End of quote. That's a damn good statement there. Bitterness destroys the container it's in. Wow. I have to remember that. So then we go to our next story here, dated October 9th from Sarah Leach at the Holland Sentinel. As Ottawa County's embattled health officer prepares to be heard in the Michigan Court of Appeals, the officials attempting to remove her are taking steps to get a potential replacement approved by the state. The Michigan Department of Health and Human Services confirmed Monday, October 9th, that the county has submitted Nathaniel Kelly's credentials and qualifications for review, quote, to serve as an interim or acting administrative health officer if current health officer Adeline Hambly is removed, end of quote. That is according to Chelsea Wuth, MDHHS Associate Public Information Officer, and that is what she wrote in an email to the Holland Sentinel. Wuth said the state, quote, received the request for immediate credentials review from County Administrator John Whalefeces Gibbs on Friday, September 29th, along with a copy of Mr. Kelly's resume, end of quote. I added Whalefeces because that's what we refer to John Gibbs on this show as, a big pile of whale feces. Kelly, whom Ottawa Impact officials tried to install January 3rd, most recently worked as a health and safety manager at a Grand Rapids area HVAC company. The attempt to appoint him was decried by some members of the public over a lack of work history in public health. So that's the attempt to hire Nathaniel Kelly. So then let's get to our next story here. This is dated October 10th. This is Sarah Leach and Mitchell Boatman writing for the Holland Sentinel. An impending hearing to fire Ottawa County Health Officer Adeline Hambley has been delayed by at least several days after an unusual meeting on the Board of Commissioners that included confusion over the group's own bylaws, state statute, and a short recess that lasted over 90 minutes. Commissioner Doug Zylstra, the board's lone Democrat, asked at the beginning of the board's regularly scheduled meeting Tuesday, October 10th, for a separate vote on scheduling a termination hearing for Hambley. Board Chair Joe Moss filed notice September 27th that a removal hearing was planned for October 19th over allegations of, quote, incompetence, misconduct, and neglect of duty, end of quote. Moss's allegations revolved largely around health department budget negotiations, which culminated in $4 million in board-orchestrated cuts and a half dozen layoffs for the fiscal year that began October 1st. Zylstra, citing Michigan law, said a board of commissioners can only call a special meeting by a request of at least one-third of the board, in this case, 4 commissioners of the 11-member board. Zylstra said the October 19th meeting was requested only by Moss. County Corporate Counsel Jack Jordan said Moss was following board rules called bylaws, but Zylstra said the statute is included in those bylaws. Jordan said he was not familiar with the statute Zylstra was referencing. Moss called for a short recess without providing a specific reason. The recess lasted 94 minutes. After the meeting resumed, Jordan said he appreciated Zylstra's, quote, input and diligence, end of quote, and indicated that there were potential legal concerns with how the meeting was scheduled. Jordan said, quote, we took a recess and I think I'm supposed to say something very eloquent about what I discovered, but I can't do that. I'm not conceding anything, but with the short notice and the amount of time, we don't have enough time to do a proper legal research on it, end of quote. Jordan indicated a decision had been made during the recess, though it was unclear what conversations took place because they didn't happen in public view. Jordan said, quote, what we're doing, we're going to accept your motion. I think Commissioner Moss is going to do that and amend the meeting date and the notice in compliance with MCL 46.10. We're going to follow that to the letter, end of quote. District 10 Commissioner Roger Bergman said he believed there was a quorum of commissioners meeting outside the boardroom during the recess, which Moss said was incorrect. He said he spoke to legal counsel and the county clerk during the break. District 7 Commissioner Rebecca Curran and District 11 Commissioner Allison Miedema both said they were not part of the quorum during the recess. Commissioners voted 10-0 in favor of adding the item to Tuesday's agenda. District 1 Commissioner Gretchen Cosby was absent. At least one resident who attended Tuesday's meeting has filed a complaint with the Michigan Attorney General's office alleging potential Open Meetings Act violations during the recess. Rebecca Patrick of Holland Township filed the complaint shortly before 3 p.m. October 10th, saying she felt Jordan's comments indicated private discussions and decisions to which the full board and public were not privy. She wrote in her email to the Attorney General's office, quote, Mr. Jordan's statement raises many questions. How did he know Commissioner Zylstra's motion was going to be accepted? What did that mean? Who would accept it? Commissioner Moss? And if Commissioner Moss accepted it, what did that mean? How did he know that the motion would pass and that therefore it would be necessary to amend the special meeting date and notice? And most of all, what went on behind the scenes with a quorum of commissioners all in one area, out of the view of the public, in the middle of discussion and a vote on a motion? End of quote. The Attorney General's office did not immediately respond to a request for comment. The Holland Sentinel has filed a Freedom of Information Act request for all Open Meetings Act violation allegations against the board since early January. Later in the meeting, Moss turned to Vice Chair Sylvia Rodea for a motion based on Council's recommendation. Rodea moved to request a special meeting at 8 a.m. Monday, October 23rd. District 9 Commissioner Roger Belknap supported the notion. Curran asked why the date needed to be changed. Jordan explained that in order to be in full compliance with the statute, the meeting needed to be properly noticed to the public at least 10 days ahead of time. The vote to schedule the special meeting passed 7-3. Moss, Rodea, Belknap, Miedema, Curran, Lucy Ebel, and Kyle Terpstra voted yes. Zylstra, Jacob Bonema, and Bergman voted no. Zylstra said he doesn't agree with the charges against Hambly. Which now leads us to our final story for today. This is Sarah Leach writing for the Holland Sentinel, dated October 11th, out of Grand Rapids. The Michigan Court of Appeals will soon decide whether Ottawa County Health Officer Annaline Hambly was rightfully appointed to her position and if a preliminary injunction preventing the county from firing her should be nullified or reinstated. Hambly sued commissioners in February, claiming the board's Ottawa Impact majority attempted to unlawfully demote her and repeatedly interfered with her state-authorized health duties. On April 18th, a circuit court judge in Muskegon granted Hambly a preliminary injunction that allowed her to remain in her role until a trial could take place later this year. The Michigan Court of Appeals denied commissioners the right to appeal the lower court's ruling, but later granted a narrow window to appeal certain aspects, mainly whether the judge made legal errors in reaching her decision. The three-judge panel, presiding Judge Michelle M. Rick, Christopher P. Yates, and Douglas B. Shapiro, heard arguments from the county's corporate counsel, David Kallman, during a hearing on Wednesday. He had two main arguments. One, Hambly was not properly appointed as the health officer in December, and two, the preliminary injunction granted by the lower court no longer applies as the board is pursuing terminating Hambly according to state statute. The judges questioned Kallman intensely on the appointment claim, saying the argument he presented that the previous Board of Commissioners approved Hambly with the intent of approving her again later didn't make logical sense. Because it doesn't. Yates said, quote, "It just seems to me to adopt your construction of this is to disregard the motion," end of quote. Kallman said the board's argument didn't disregard the motion from December, but rather followed it to the letter. Yates said, quote, "If we logically sequence this, first we approve, second MDHHS approves, third she passes the background check and she's good to go," end of quote. Kallman said, quote, "But that's not what they did. They added another approval," end of quote. Yates appeared to be skeptical of that answer. He asked, quote, "I don't know why we would accept that and create chaos. Don't you see the problem with that?" End of quote. Kallman replied, quote, "No, Your Honor, I don't," end of quote. What appeared to be of more intense interest was the injunction granted by the lower court as the county moves forward with termination proceedings against Hambly according to state law, a point that Hambly's attorney Sarah Riley Howard disputes. Howard said her client has made several claims of retaliation by the board that fall under the Whistleblowers Protection Act and alleged the OI-led board is not acting in good faith. Quote, "Defendants have said Hambly isn't entitled to due process. They already demonstrated they won't comply with due process. They have indicated that they will remove her by any means necessary," end of quote. She pointed to a termination hearing Moss scheduled last week. The planned October 19th date for that hearing was rescheduled to at least October 23rd on Tuesday after the Board of Commissioners took a formal vote. The date was pushed back because the board must provide 10-day notice to the public. The new date is likely to be rescheduled as well if the proceeding is allowed to move forward because Howard is in federal court October 23rd and Hambly has a right to representation under state law. Yates underscored the fact that the appellate court is not a trial court. He asked Howard, quote, "Do we send this back to the trial court?" Howard said, unfortunately, no, end of quote. Adding the kickback would only work if Howard is given enough time to seek relief from the lower court ahead of the planned termination hearing. Yates said, quote, "We understand the gravity of the situation," end of quote. Since the lawsuit was filed, OI-backed commissioners have leveled heavy criticism at the health department. The budget process that ramped up in August ahead of the new fiscal year, which began October 1st, was also especially contentious, as OI commissioners sought deep cuts to the health department that have already resulted in half a dozen layoffs. As the court adjourned after about 40 minutes, Rick said the judges would issue a decision shortly. By the way, here are the charges that Ottawa County, that Ottawa Impact has leveled against Hambly. They said that Hambly demonstrated incompetence, misconduct, and neglect of duty by making false public representations about budgetary scenarios. That Hambly demonstrated incompetence, misconduct, and neglect of duty by falsely claiming that she was not included in the budget process. That Hambly demonstrated incompetence, misconduct, and neglect of duty by failing to cooperate in the budget process. And that Hambly demonstrated incompetence, misconduct, and neglect of duty by making false claims that encouraged and caused confusion, anxiety, fear, and panic in the community. Zylstra said that staff had the right to communicate with the board and the public on matters affecting their department and, quote, shouldn't face retribution for that, end of quote. All right, and we've just received late-breaking news. This is out of Grand Rapids, Michigan. This is Katie Rosendale writing for Wood Television. The Michigan Court of Appeals decided today that Ottawa County's Administrative Health Officer Adeline Hambly was correctly appointed as health officer, but the Board of Commissioners can still fire her if it complies with Michigan law. In an opinion released Thursday morning, the Michigan Court of Appeals said that Hambly had been properly appointed as health officer. On December 13, 2022, the Board of Commissioners approved her appointment by unanimous vote, and the board chairs signed a resolution memorializing the action of the commission appointing Hambly. In its opinion, the court wrote that the language of the 2022 resolution was, quote, unambiguous, end of quote. The court said, quote, we view defendant's invitation to parse and favor the meeting minutes and video recording in the face of unambiguous language in the 2022 resolution as a recipe for chaos, end of quote. In the second part of its opinion, the Michigan Court of Appeals ruled Thursday that Hambly could be fired if the Board of Commissioners showed sufficient cause. Although the Court of Appeals acknowledged the importance of some injunctive relief, it ultimately ruled Thursday that the sweeping initial injunction, quote, deprives the commission of authority granted to it by Michigan law, namely the ability to terminate Hambly if she's proved to be incompetent in the position or guilty of misconduct or habitual and willful neglect of duty, end of quote. Thus, the court upheld its June decision to throw out part of the injunction. So now, according to the Holland Sentinel, the meeting is going to be held October 24th for the possible removal of Adeline Hambly. And if that happens, then she needs to turn around and file a whistleblower lawsuit and totally bankrupt the county. Get rid of it. Wipe it out. $100 million. That's what you need to do. You need to put these evil, violent, conservative traitors under notice that their crap isn't going to be tolerated anymore. That's it for this week. We'll be back next week. I'm Darren Gibson. Please support independent media, the First Amendment, and a woman's right to choose.
The stations that carry Southpaws do not necessarily share the opinions expressed on the show. Southpaws is protected by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and is copyrighted by Big D Entertainment. All rights reserved.